The emergency alert pierced through the 3 a.m. silence like a scream. Marcus Chen's phone vibrated against the wooden nightstand with such violence that it nearly tumbled to the floor. He reached for it instinctively, his hand moving before his mind fully registered consciousness. The screen's blue light carved harsh shadows across his face as his eyes struggled to focus on the words that would change everything. Critical security breach detected. Unauthorized access to primary financial systems. Estimated loss, $23 million. For 3 long seconds, Marcus simply stared at the notification. His throat constricted. His chest felt hollow, as if someone had reached inside and removed something vital. This wasn't just a security breach. This was the nightmare he had predicted, documented, and begged them to prevent. This was every warning he'd written in those 17 emails, every concern he'd voiced in those endless meetings where CEO Richard Stallworth had smiled that condescending smile and told him he was being overly cautious and paranoid about theoretical risks. Marcus sat up in bed, his cotton sheets falling away from his shoulders. The apartment was cold. He always kept it cold, a habit from his childhood in Seattle, where his mother had insisted that cool air helped you think clearly. He needed to think clearly now. His fingers moved across the phone screen with practiced precision, pulling up the security dashboard that he'd built himself, the one that Stallworth had called excessive and an unnecessary allocation of resources. The data painted a story that made his stomach turn. The breach had started at 2:47 a.m. Someone had used a combination of social engineering and a vulnerability in the company's third-party payment processor, the exact vulnerability Marcus had highlighted in his September report, the one titled Critical Infrastructure Weaknesses, a Roadmap for Disaster. Stallworth had laughed when Marcus presented it during the board meeting. Actually laughed. The sound had echoed in the conference room, and several board members had joined in, their expensive suits rustling as they shifted in their leather chairs. "Marcus, you're a brilliant kid," Stallworth had said, his voice dripping with the kind of patronizing warmth that older men use when they want to dismiss younger ones without seeming cruel. "You're being overly cautious and paranoid about theoretical risks." Marcus stood there, his carefully prepared slides glowing behind him on the projector screen, his hands trembling slightly as he held the laser pointer. He was 28 years old, the youngest chief security officer in the company's 40-year history, and in that moment, he'd felt like a child being scolded for having an overactive imagination. "Sir, with respect, we handle financial transactions for over 300 hospitals and clinics. We process payments exceeding $2 billion annually. That makes us an extremely attractive target. The vulnerabilities I've identified are theoretical," Stallworth had interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. His Rolex caught the light, a flash of gold that seemed to punctuate his certainty. "Theoretical problems require theoretical solutions, and theoretical solutions cost real money. Money we need to spend on actual business growth, not on fears about what might happen." Now, sitting in his dark bedroom with the evidence of catastrophe glowing on his phone screen, Marcus felt a complex mixture of vindication and horror. He'd been right. God, how he wished he'd been wrong. He pushed himself out of bed and padded across the hardwood floor to his desk. His apartment was modest, 1 bedroom in a converted warehouse building in the city's tech district. The walls were exposed brick, and his furniture was mostly second-hand, purchased from estate sales and refurbished with care. A potted succulent sat on the windowsill, its leaves thick and green, a gift from his colleague Sarah, who'd insisted that his workspace needed something alive to remind you that not everything is ones and zeros. Sarah. He needed to call Sarah. Marcus pulled on a pair of jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt from the chair where he draped them the night before. His laptop was already open on the desk. He rarely closed it completely, another habit that his ex-girlfriend had found maddening. "You're married to that machine," she'd said during their last argument. She wasn't entirely wrong. He dialed Sarah's number while his laptop booted up his secure VPN connection. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep but sharpening quickly when she heard the tension in his greeting. "Marcus? What's wrong?" "It happened," he said simply. "Everything I warned them about. It happened." There was a pause, and he could hear her moving, the rustle of blankets, the creak of her bed frame. Sarah Okonkwo was the company's director of IT operations, a woman 10 years his senior who'd taken him under her wing when he'd first joined MedLogix 3 years ago. She was brilliant, pragmatic, and one of the few people in the organization who'd actually listened to his warnings instead of dismissing them. "The financial systems?" she asked. $23 million, Marcus confirmed, his fingers already flying across his keyboard. They used the exact entry point I documented, the third-party processor vulnerability, the one Stallworth said wasn't worth the $80,000 it would have cost to fix. Jesus Christ. Sarah's voice was quiet, but Marcus could hear the weight in it. "Are you at home? Don't go into the office yet. Let me make some calls. This is going to be bad, Marcus." "I know. No, I mean for you, for us. When something like this happens, companies look for scapegoats. You're the CSO. You're young. You're the one who's been sending those emails, documenting everything. Stallworth is going to try to pin this on you." Marcus's hands stilled on the keyboard. He hadn't thought that far ahead yet. His mind had been focused on the breach itself, on understanding how it happened and what could be done to contain it. But Sarah was right. In the brutal mathematics of corporate blame, the person who'd warned about a disaster was often confused with the person responsible for preventing it. "I documented everything," Marcus said, and he heard the defensiveness creeping into his own voice. "Every warning, every recommendation, every time they rejected my proposals. It's all in writing." "I know, sweetheart, and that might save you, but it's also going to make you a very inconvenient witness to the company's negligence. Be careful. Please." They talked for another 10 minutes, Sarah methodically walking him through the immediate steps he needed to take, document the current state of the breach, preserve all evidence, prepare a timeline of events, and most importantly, back up every email, every report, every piece of communication that showed he'd raised these concerns. By the time they hung up, Marcus felt marginally more centered, though the knot in his stomach had only tightened. He spent the next 2 hours in what he thought of as crisis mode, his mind sharp and focused despite the lack of sleep. The breach was sophisticated but not unprecedented. The attackers had spent weeks inside the system, moving laterally, escalating privileges, learning the architecture. They'd been patient and methodical, professional. This wasn't some opportunistic script kiddie. This was an organized group with resources and planning, and they'd followed his roadmap almost exactly. Marcus pulled up his September report again, the one he'd titled with perhaps too much dramatic flair. He'd spent 3 weeks preparing it, working late nights and weekends, documenting every vulnerability he could find in MedLogix's sprawling infrastructure. The company had grown rapidly over the past decade, acquiring smaller competitors and integrating their systems in a patchwork of technologies that ranged from cutting-edge to dangerously obsolete. Marcus had found holes everywhere, but the third-party payment processor had been the most critical. It was the gateway to everything: the financial records, the transaction histories, the client data. He'd even created a hypothetical attack scenario in his report, a step-by-step breakdown of how a malicious actor could exploit the vulnerability. It was meant to illustrate the severity of the risk, to make it concrete and undeniable. He'd written it in clear, non-technical language so that even board members without IT backgrounds could understand. Looking at the attack logs now, Marcus realized, with a sinking feeling, that the attackers had followed his roadmap almost exactly. Every step he'd outlined as a possibility, they'd executed as reality. It was like watching someone perform a play he'd written, except stage was his company's infrastructure, and the final act was millions of dollars vanishing into the digital void. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Daniel Park, the company's CFO, and one of the few executives who'd shown any interest in Marcus's security concerns. "Meeting at 6 a.m. Richard's office. Be there." Marcus glanced at the clock. It was 5:23 a.m. He had 37 minutes to shower, dress, and prepare himself for what would likely be the most difficult meeting of his professional life. He closed his laptop and stood up, his joints stiff from hours of sitting. His reflection caught his eye in the darkened window, a lean man with dark hair that needed cutting, shadows under his eyes, wearing a faded t-shirt with a binary code joke that nobody found funny anymore. His mother had called him last week, asking when he was going to find a real job, something that didn't keep him up at night worrying about invisible threats. She'd never understood his work, never grasped why he cared so much about protecting systems that seemed abstract to her. "You're too smart to be so stressed," she'd said, and he hadn't known how to explain that intelligence and stress weren't opposites, that sometimes seeing dangers others couldn't was its own burden. Marcus showered quickly, the hot water doing little to ease the tension in his shoulders. He dressed in one of his few good shirts, a blue button-down that Sarah had helped him pick out for his last presentation, and dark slacks. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror and practiced keeping his face neutral. He would need that today. The ability to remain calm while everything burned around him. The drive to MedLogic's headquarters usually took 25 minutes, but at this hour, with the city still mostly asleep, Marcus made it in 15. The building was a sleek structure of glass and steel, 6 stories of modern corporate architecture in the city's business district. When he'd first started working here, he'd been impressed by the aesthetics. The way morning light flooded through the enormous windows, the open floor plan that was supposed to encourage collaboration and innovation. Now, approaching the building in the pre-dawn darkness, it looked different, vulnerable. All that glass, all those windows, suddenly seemed less like a symbol of transparency and more like an invitation to be watched, to be broken into, to be exposed. The elevator ride to the 6th floor felt interminable. Marcus stood alone in the brushed steel box, watching the floor numbers illuminate and dim in sequence. His reflection appeared in fragments across the polished walls, multiple versions of himself, all looking equally uncertain. He carried his laptop bag over one shoulder, the weight of it familiar and oddly comforting. Inside were 3 years of documentation, proof that he'd done everything he could to prevent this disaster. The executive suite was already illuminated when he arrived, light spilling from beneath the doors like something leaking out. He could hear voices, Stallworth's booming baritone, Daniel's measured responses, and someone else he didn't immediately recognize. He knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission. This wasn't a time for politeness. Richard Stallworth stood behind his massive oak desk, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing emphatically at nothing. He was 62 years old, a man who'd built MedLogix from a small regional distributor into a national powerhouse through what he called aggressive expansion and calculated risk-taking. His gray hair was impeccably styled even at this ungodly hour, and he wore a suit that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. His face was red, not the healthy flush of exercise, but the mottled crimson of barely contained rage. Daniel Park sat in one of the leather chairs facing the desk, his own laptop open, fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. He looked up when Marcus entered and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Daniel was 45, methodical and precise, the kind of CFO who actually read security reports instead of delegating them to subordinates. He'd been Marcus's only real ally at the executive level. The third person in the room was someone Marcus had only seen in photographs, Jennifer Holt, MedLogix's legal counsel. She was in her 50s, wearing a navy pantsuit, her expression carved from granite. She sat in the corner with a legal pad balanced on her knee, taking notes in shorthand. Stallworth ended his call with an abrupt, "I'll call you back," and tossed his phone onto the desk with enough force that Marcus flinched. The CEO's eyes fixed on him with an intensity that felt physical. "Marcus, sit down." It wasn't a request. Marcus sat in the chair next to Daniel, setting his laptop bag carefully at his feet.
The office smelled of coffee and expensive cologne, undercut by something else, the acrid scent of fear and fury. "Tell me," Stallworth said, his voice dangerously quiet, "how $23 million vanished from our systems while our chief security officer was presumably watching over them?" Marcus had prepared for this question during his drive over. He'd rehearsed his answer, stripped it of any defensiveness, focused on facts. The breach occurred through the third-party payment processor that handles our hospital and clinic transactions. The attackers used a combination of— "I don't want a technical explanation," Stallworth interrupted. "I want to know why this happened on your watch. We pay you 6 figures to prevent exactly this kind of disaster." "With respect, sir, this didn't happen on my watch. It happened despite my watch. I documented this exact vulnerability in my September report, the one I presented to the board, the one where I requested $80,000 to implement proper security protocols for the payment processor." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Stallworth's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath his carefully shaved cheek. "Are you seriously going to sit there and tell me this is my fault?" "I'm telling you that I identified the risk, quantified the cost of mitigation, and was overruled. That's not assigning fault, that's stating fact." Jennifer Holt cleared her throat. "Marcus, perhaps you could walk us through exactly what happened tonight, timeline and methodology. That would be helpful for our understanding and for any potential law enforcement investigation." Marcus nodded, grateful for the redirect. He pulled out his laptop and opened his analysis. The initial compromise occurred at 2:47 a.m. The attackers had been inside our network for at least 18 days prior to that, based on the log files I've reviewed. They entered through a phishing email sent to someone in accounting. We're still determining who clicked the link. From there, they moved laterally through the network, escalating privileges until they reached the payment processor interface. He turned his laptop around so the others could see the screen, where he'd mapped out the attack pathway in a visual diagram. Once they had access to the processor, they initiated a series of transactions that appeared legitimate within the system, but actually routed funds to offshore accounts. The transactions were small enough individually that they didn't trigger our automated fraud detection, but collectively, they totaled just over $23 million. Daniel leaned forward, studying the diagram. How long would they have needed to plan this? Weeks, maybe months. They would have needed time to study our systems, understand our transaction patterns, identify the optimal windows for extraction. This was professional and premeditated. "Could it have been prevented?" Jennifer asked, her pen poised above her legal pad. Marcus met her eyes. "Yes. With the security protocols I recommended in September, this specific attack vector would have been closed. The enhanced authentication requirements, the real-time transaction monitoring, the isolated network segments, any of those measures would have significantly reduced the likelihood of success, and all of them together would have made this type of breach nearly impossible." "Nearly," Stallworth seized on the word. "So even with your recommendations, this still could have happened." "In security, there are no absolute guarantees, but there are probabilities. Without the proper protocols, this attack had maybe an 80% probability of success. With the protocols I suggested, that probability drops below 10%. That's the difference between possible and plausible." Stallworth walked around his desk and leaned against it, arms crossed over his chest. In the growing dawn light filtering through the windows behind him, he was a silhouette, a dark shape against brightness.
"Let me tell you what I see, Marcus. I see a young man who's been in his position for less than 2 years, who sent me 17 emails, yes, I counted, full of doom and gloom predictions. I see someone who seems almost excited about being proven right, about saying, 'I told you so.'" The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Marcus felt his face flush hot, then cold. "I take no pleasure in this, none. I'm devastated that it happened. But I am not going to pretend that I didn't warn you. I have documentation. Your documentation," Stallworth said, "is going to be a problem for you. because what it shows is that you identified these vulnerabilities and then failed to protect us anyway. It shows that you knew exactly how to break into our systems. It shows that you created what amounts to a blueprint for this attack." The implication struck Marcus like a fist to the sternum. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Daniel's head snapped up from his laptop. "Richard, you can't possibly be suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Stallworth said smoothly. "I'm simply observing that the optics here are complicated. Our CSO writes a detailed document explaining how to steal millions from us, and then months later, someone does exactly that. Law enforcement is going to look at that very carefully." Jennifer Holt's pen had stopped moving. She was watching Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read. Concern, perhaps, or calculation. "Richard, I should advise you that any implication of employee involvement should be handled very carefully and with proper legal procedures. We don't want to create liability for the company." Marcus found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "I documented those vulnerabilities because that's my job, because I was trying to protect this company. And if you're seriously suggesting that I would engineer a theft from my own employer, then we have nothing more to discuss until I have my own legal representation present." He stood up, his legs unsteady but functional. The room tilted slightly, then righted itself. Stallworth pushed off from the desk, moving into Marcus's space with the practiced aggression of someone used to physical intimidation. "Sit down." "No, not if you're going to accuse me of criminal activity. I'll cooperate fully with any investigation, but I'm not going to sit here and be threatened. If you want to fire me, but you don't get to make me into your scapegoat." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient sounds of the building, the HVAC system, the distant elevator, the pre-dawn traffic from the street below seemed to fade away. Stallworth's face had gone from red to almost purple. Marcus wondered distantly if the man was going to have a heart attack right there in his office. "Gentlemen," Jennifer said quietly, "let's all take a breath. This is an extremely stressful situation, but we need to proceed thoughtfully. Marcus, no one is accusing you of anything. Richard is upset, understandably so, and perhaps not expressing himself as clearly as he might. But you're right that if there's any question of employee involvement, that investigation needs to be handled by law enforcement, not by us." She stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Here's what I propose. Marcus, you should go home. Take the rest of today. Let us handle the immediate crisis management and the authorities. Document everything you've done over the past 24 hours, your investigation, your findings, your analysis. Make it available to us and to law enforcement. Tomorrow, we'll have a clearer picture of what happened and what steps need to be taken." "He's not going home," Stallworth said. "We need him here. We need to understand these systems."
"Richard," Daniel spoke up, his voice carefully neutral. "Marcus has been up all night investigating this. He's given us his preliminary analysis. Let him rest. I can handle the immediate technical questions, and we have the rest of the IT team. We need Marcus fresh for when the FBI arrives, not exhausted and defensive." Stallworth looked like he wanted to argue, but Jennifer gave him a look that Marcus interpreted as some kind of silent legal counsel communication. After a long moment, the CEO nodded curtly. "Fine. Go home, Marcus. Be available. And understand that everything you've done, every email, every report, every system you've accessed, is going to be examined. If there's anything you need to disclose, now would be the time." Marcus picked up his laptop bag, his hands steadier now that the immediate confrontation was ending. "There's nothing to disclose. I did my job. I tried to protect us. I failed because I wasn't given the resources to succeed. That's the truth, and it's the truth I'll tell to anyone who asks." He walked to the door, each step measured and deliberate. His hand was on the handle when Stallworth spoke again. "Marcus." He turned. The CEO had moved back behind his desk, reclaiming his position of power, but in the morning light, he looked older than Marcus had ever seen him, the shadows under his eyes deep as bruises. "This company is 40 years old, 40 years of my life. My father started it in a warehouse with 3 employees and a dream. I'm not going to let it die because of one mistake, one oversight, one failure to listen to the right warning at the right time. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Marcus understood perfectly. Stallworth would sacrifice anyone, including Marcus, to save his legacy. But he just nodded and left the office. The elevator ride down was faster than the ride up, gravity pulling him toward ground level, toward escape. The building's lobby was still empty, the security guard at the desk looking half asleep. Marcus walked out into the early morning air where the city was just beginning to wake up. Delivery trucks rumbled past. A woman jogged by with a golden retriever. The sky was lightening from black to deep blue. His car was where he'd left it, and he sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine. His phone showed missed calls. His mother, Sarah, 2 unknown numbers that were probably reporters somehow. Word was getting out already. Of course it was. $23 million didn't disappear quietly. Marcus drove home on autopilot, his mind replaying the confrontation in Stallworth's office. The barely veiled accusations, the threat of legal scrutiny, the realization that his carefully documented warnings meant to protect him might instead be weaponized against him. Sarah had been right. He was the convenient scapegoat. Young enough to be expendable, senior enough to be responsible, thorough enough to have created a paper trail that could be interpreted as either diligence or something darker. Back in his apartment, Marcus made coffee he didn't want and stood at his window watching the city fully wake up. Office workers began appearing on the streets, moving toward their buildings like ants following well-worn paths. Somewhere out there, the people who'd stolen $23 million were probably sleeping peacefully, their work complete, their accounts full. And here he was, exhausted and accused, punished for being right. His phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and he answered. "How bad was it?" He tried to suggest I might be involved. "Jesus." "Yeah." "Marcus, listen to me. You need to protect yourself. Get a lawyer. Not tomorrow, not next week. Today, right now. I've seen this before. Companies in crisis look for blood, and they don't always care whose." "I know. I will. Promise me." "I promise." They talked for a few more minutes, Sarah offering advice he was too tired to fully absorb. When they hung up, Marcus looked at his desk, at his laptop, at the succulent plant that Sarah had given him. It needed water. He should water it, but instead he lay down on his couch, still wearing his good shirt and his dress slacks, and closed his eyes. Sleep wouldn't come, but exhaustion did. He drifted in that strange space between waking and unconsciousness, where thoughts became loose and unmoored. He thought about his mother asking about his real job. He thought about his ex-girlfriend saying he was married to his machine. He thought about the September report, about Stallworth's laughter in the boardroom, about the sound of that Rolex catching light like a promise that money could solve anything. He thought about the hackers, whoever they were, sitting somewhere in the world with 23 million reasons to celebrate. And he thought about how, in his report, he'd written, "This is not a question of if, but when." When? It had happened right on schedule, just as he'd predicted. But prediction without prevention was just prophecy, and nobody ever thanked Cassandra for being right. The news broke while Marcus was sitting on his couch, staring at nothing. His phone erupted with notifications, news alerts, text messages, emails, social media tags. He picked it up reluctantly and saw the headline on the Tech Business Daily homepage. MedLogix suffers massive cyber attack. $23 million stolen in sophisticated breach. The article was surprisingly detailed for something published less than 6 hours after the attack. Someone had talked. Marcus skimmed through the paragraphs, his stomach sinking with each sentence. The reporter had quotes from an anonymous source close to the investigation who described the breach as preventable and suggested that internal security failures were to blame. The source noted that MedLogic's chief security officer had raised concerns, but that leadership had not prioritized cybersecurity investments. On one level, the article vindicated Marcus, but on another it painted a target on his back. He was mentioned by name in the 6th paragraph, Marcus Chen, 28, who has served as CSO for 18 months, along with a detail that made his blood run cold. Chen had reportedly created detailed documents outlining potential security vulnerabilities, documents that some sources suggest could have served as a blueprint for the attack. There it was. The narrative Stallworth had started in his office was already leaking into the public discourse. Marcus wasn't just the security officer who'd failed to stop the breach, he was potentially complicit in creating it. His phone rang. An unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. It rang again immediately, a different unknown number. This time he answered. Mr. Chen, this is Detective Amanda Roberts with the Cybercrimes Unit. I need to ask you some questions about the MedLogic's breach. Marcus closed his eyes. Am I being accused of something, Detective? Not at this time, but we're conducting a preliminary investigation and your cooperation would be appreciated. Can you come to the precinct this afternoon, say 2 o'clock? I'd prefer to have legal counsel present. There was a pause. That's your right, of course. But I should mention that voluntary cooperation tends to look better than lawyering up immediately. We're just trying to understand what happened. Detective Roberts, I've spent the last 4 hours being subtly accused of helping to engineer a theft from my own company. Forgive me if I don't take any chances with voluntary cooperation. I'll be there at 2 with my attorney. He hung up before she could respond, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He needed a lawyer. Sarah had insisted, and now the police are calling. How quickly things escalated. How fast you could go from security professional to criminal suspect. Marcus searched online for criminal defense attorneys specializing in white-collar crime. The options were overwhelming and depressing. Rows of serious faces in expensive suits, all promising aggressive defense and proven results. He finally called a firm that Sarah had mentioned once, explaining his situation to the receptionist in clipped sentences. "How soon can you meet with someone?" the receptionist asked. "Today. Now. As soon as possible." "Let me check. Hold, please." The hold music was smooth jazz, completely inappropriate for the crisis churning in Marcus's mind. He stood up and paced his apartment. 3 steps to the window, 3 steps back. The city outside looked unchanged. People were still going about their lives, unaware that his was quietly imploding. "Mr. Chen?" the receptionist returned. "Mr. Lawrence can see you in 45 minutes. Will that work?" "Yes. Thank you. Yes." Robert Lawrence turned out to be a man in his late 50s with silver hair and a manner that radiated expensive competence. His office was in a high-rise downtown, all dark wood and leather-bound law books that probably hadn't been opened in years, but served an important atmospheric purpose. He listened to Marcus's story without interrupting, taking occasional notes on a yellow legal pad. When Marcus finished, Lawrence leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "First, you did the right thing calling me. Second, this is manageable, but it's going to be expensive and stressful. Third, the optics are bad. A young CSO who documented vulnerabilities that were then exploited. The police are going to look at you very carefully. I didn't do anything wrong. I believe you. But belief and proof are different things. The fact that you have extensive documentation is good and bad. Good because it shows you were doing your job. Bad because it shows you had detailed knowledge of how to penetrate the system." "That's insane!"
That's like saying a doctor who diagnoses a disease must have given it to the patient. I agree it's illogical, but criminal investigations aren't always logical, especially in the early stages. They're looking for patterns, connections, anything that fits a narrative. Right now, the narrative that's emerging is that you knew exactly how to steal this money. Marcus felt his chest tighten. What do I do? You cooperate fully, but carefully. You don't volunteer information, but you answer questions truthfully. You let me handle all communication with law enforcement. And you document everything, where you were, what you were doing, who can vouch for you. Do you have an alibi for the time of the breach? I was asleep, alone, in my apartment. Lawrence grimaced. That's unfortunate. No one who can confirm that? No. What about your computer activity? Can we show you weren't accessing MedLogic systems at that time? Maybe. I'd have to check my logs. They spent another hour going over details, preparing for the police interview. Lawrence coached Marcus on how to answer questions, what to avoid, how to maintain composure. By the time Marcus left the office, he felt marginally better prepared, but exponentially more anxious. This was really happening. He was actually preparing for a police interrogation. The interview at the precinct was exactly as uncomfortable as Marcus had imagined. Detective Roberts was younger than he had expected, probably in her mid-30s, with short red hair and sharp green eyes that seemed to catalog everything about him. She was polite, but relentless, asking questions that circled around the same core suspicions. How did he know so much about the vulnerabilities? Why had he been so detailed in his reports? Had he communicated with anyone outside the company about security issues? Did he have any financial difficulties? Lawrence interrupted frequently, redirecting questions, preventing Marcus from over-explaining. By the time 90 minutes were over, Marcus felt wrung out like a dish rag. Roberts thanked them both, said she'd be in touch, and watched them leave with an expression that revealed nothing. How did I do? Marcus asked in the parking lot.
You did fine. But Chen, I need you to understand something. This investigation is going to get worse before it gets better. They're going to dig into every aspect of your life. Bank records, emails, phone calls. If there's anything questionable, anything at all, you need to tell me now. There's nothing. I don't even have a parking ticket. Good. Keep it that way. And be prepared for the media attention. Once they identify you as a person of interest, your life is going to become very public. Marcus drove home in a fog of anxiety. The phrase person of interest kept echoing in his mind. That's what they called people who weren't officially suspects, but might as well be. He thought about calling his mother, but couldn't bear the thought of explaining this to her, of hearing the worry and confusion in her voice. Instead, he called Sarah. "Where are you?" she asked immediately. "Just left the police station." Jesus, how bad? They think I might have helped plan this, or at least that I'm suspicious enough to investigate thoroughly. Marcus, I am so sorry. This is exactly what I was afraid of. It's not your fault. I know, but I feel guilty anyway. Listen, there's something you should know. Stallworth held a company-wide meeting this morning. Told everyone there'd been a security breach, that we're cooperating with authorities, and that he has full confidence in the investigation process. He didn't mention you by name, but everyone knows you're the CSO. There's talk. What kind of talk? The kind you'd expect. Some people defending you, saying you tried to warn leadership, others saying maybe you were involved. It's ugly, Marcus. I'd stay away from the office for a while. I'm supposed to be available. Jennifer Holt told me. Jennifer Holt doesn't have to walk past people whispering about whether you're a criminal. Trust me, stay home. Work remotely if you need to work, but don't come in. That evening, Marcus's story made the local news. He watched himself on television, a photo from his company ID, slightly pixelated, displayed next to the anchor's carefully neutral face. 28-year-old Marcus Chan, MedLogic's chief security officer, is cooperating with investigators, the anchor said, and he heard the subtext. Cooperating meant suspected. His phone continued to ring, reporters mostly, but also a few numbers he recognized. Friends from college who'd seen the news and wanted to check in. His mother, finally, her voice rising in panic when he answered. He tried to calm her, to explain that he hadn't done anything wrong, that this was all a misunderstanding. She didn't sound convinced, and he couldn't blame her. He wasn't sure he'd convinced himself. The next morning brought a new nightmare. Marcus woke to find his social media accounts flooded with messages. Someone had found his Facebook profile, his LinkedIn, his rarely used Twitter account. The messages ranged from supportive, like "hang in there, truth will come out," to vicious, like "I hope you rot in prison, thief."